Today's Monday, the 27th of January, and today I want to give you an update on the progress of the bill and particularly what to expect in the coming weeks. And secondly, I want to talk about dandelions and get into the roots. No, I don't, but that's an illustration to help you have something in mind to remember what the main point of this is. All to do with the bill, but we're going to start, first of all, asking ourselves, where is the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill up to, and how quickly will it move on? We're currently in the committee stage. There'll be 2 sessions tomorrow. There'll be 2 sessions on Thursday, and that continues through till the 11th of February, when the committee has to end, and it will then produce a report. Now, some people are wondering if there'll be another oral evidence session. If there is, that will be very, very unusual. Normally, if you look back through the records of bills that have been through this stage before, through the committee stage before, you will see that they always have their oral evidence sessions right at the start of the sitting, if they have them at all, and then they get down to the clause by clause debates, and they move through it like that. So last Tuesday, a week ago, we saw the first 2 evidence sessions, and I'll be coming back to one of them later. What happens after the 11th of February? The committee have got to report to the whole House, and that's called the report stage. Now, there is no fixed time between the end of the committee stage and the start of the report stage. It could be 2 or 3 days. I think in reality, we can probably expect it to be nearer 2 weeks. Might be 3, could be 4, but I think the reality, given the pressure the government wants to get this bill through the House, it will be 2 weeks. So if it is, we're looking in the working week that begins the 24th of February. So that means it will get the report stage before the end of this month, or likely to. What happens at report stage? Right, this is a debate. Other MPs and members of the committee can suggest further amendments. The report is the updated bill that the committee have done, and then other MPs can bring in things. And so before then, if you want to try and influence your MP, that is your target. We don't know when it will be. It will be announced maybe a week or 2 weeks in advance. We'll have some warning, but we're moving now out of the stage of writing to the committee back to the stage of writing to your MP. And better than writing to them, trying to talk to them. And you can share your stories, keep sharing those stories. But this is the time to communicate with your MP and get them to see what issues this bill is going to cause in the lives of their citizens, particularly around children's not in school registers, and also around the independent educational institutions, many small learning communities that have grown up. The same day, there will be another stage. The report stage will end, and they will immediately take the 3rd reading. This is really just a procedural thing. It's probably a remnant from what used to happen. These days, it's fairly quick, no more than an hour. It's still an opportunity for amendments to be put forward, and quite often it's a time when people try and wreck a bill, but I don't think this one's going to be wrecked. I think this one's going to actually be taken, and it's going to get through. Once it's got through the 3rd reading, it goes immediately into the House of Lords. If the 3rd reading ends at a reasonable time, it could be later that day, but more commonly, the next day, the bill has its first reading in the House of Lords. There is no debate. There is nothing other than what happened at the first reading in the Commons. Title of the bill will be read out and it's put on the books and it's put in the calendar. Now, the convention in the House of Lords is exactly that which was in the House of Commons. You have to have 2 weekends between the first reading and the second reading. So let's say the first reading is just before the end of February. That means by mid-March, Lords and Baronesses, the peers of the House of Lords, could have the second reading of this bill. And so you need to begin to think about how to lobby them and get through to them. Now, that's not like writing to your MP. Your MP has kind of got a contract with you. Your MP is there to serve you and recognise you and work with you and look after your interests. Lords don't. You have to find lords who in the past have expressed things in interest in the areas this bill is about. But remember, the majority of lords are in favour of registration and monitoring, and they've also believed the silly rhetoric about illegal schools. If these schools had been illegal, let me tell you, Ofsted would have shut them down by now. They're not illegal because they're not schools. They don't meet the requirement for registration of schools. And the clauses 30 to 37 are about catching up all these people and making them register. So it's 2 sets of registers really we need to be concerned about. So the majority of lords will not want to listen, but there's a few who are. But what I want to suggest to you here is it would be a lot better not to do a paper dump on them. It's very important that you don't do a paper dump. You have to get their attention. And the best way to do that is with a short introductory letter. And it would be even better. Here's a new suggestion. If you're part of a group in your community of home educators who do things together, why not write a joint letter? A letter with half a dozen, 20 families putting their name to it to appear would be far more effective than 20 individual letters. Keep it short as well. Your first letter should be short. You need to say to them, you're worried about the bill. It will badly impact your families. Please, are you willing for me to send you some more information? If you make a request, that will be better heard than sending them a paper dump of 7 or 8 pages. They are busy people. They're not there to represent you. They're there because most peers these days have expertise in the area of one form or another, and they're there to pool that, which actually makes it a much more effective house in many ways than the Commons, but we're not going there today. So do write to them. Do begin to organise yourselves now to write to Lords, because in a month's time, the bill might be landing with them. It might be 5 weeks. I hope it's 6 weeks, but it might be 4 weeks away. That's how close we are. But please think about not writing as individuals. Try and get some collective and send them a collective letter of introduction. That's your first approach. Don't send them piles of paper. Let me say it again. Do that. And that will be the important thing. So that's the update on where the bill is and what action you can be doing. Please, yes, get back to your MPs now, readiness for the third reading, but also begin to do some research on the Lords. Find out, don't overwhelm them. That's why I'm saying you're better to write as a group than as individuals. 20 letters 2 or 3 pages long. No Lord is going to read it. 1 page from 20 people, they might just read it. And that gets them interested. Once they're interested, see if they ask them in your letter if they'll have more material. Let's work through this one wisely. Okay, so that's the update on the bill. I now want to move on to these dandelions and the roots of them. So I'll introduce it, then I'll get back to actually why I'm saying this. Last week, after the first of the committee stage sessions, the first 2, TES, a well-known educational publication, published an article that says experts tell MPs what changes are needed. Don't get excited. They didn't tell them to do away with the registers. The last 2 witnesses were actually members of the committee. It was the Education Secretary, Catherine McKinnell, and her sidekick, Stephen Morgan, who were being quizzed by the committee. And the TES reported it and said about it that McKinnell said that the government will be engaging with stakeholders to ensure that any burdens the registers impose on parents are minimised in reference to children's not in school register. When I read that, I thought, that sounds too good to be true. They've come to the point of saying, perhaps we're dumping too much on people. Well, when you hear something like that, even if it's in a newspaper, you need to check it out, don't you? So where do we go? I went to the transcript on Parliament's website, and I'm not going to read that for you. What I will do, I will let them tell you it in their own words. Here's the video of that encounter that the TES will report.
On the children, on the register of children not in school and the powers that you're giving to local authorities to deny parents the right to homeschool. Can I just go back to some of the questions I asked witnesses earlier? Why have you put such an onerous list of items of information that you want from parents? Do you really need that to be able to operate an effective register? And why, given the state of SEND provision in our state sector, is it right that you are giving local authorities the power to say no to a parent who doesn't feel their child's needs are being met in a special school and wishes to withdraw them? Will you reconsider that, given the concerns from parents who send children?
Okay, so I mean, there's an awful lot of questions in there. I'm not sure whether we have time to address them all, but obviously our fundamental approach to this is that all children have the right to a safe and suitable education, whether they're educated at school or otherwise, and we have given quite significant consideration and consultation on the with stakeholders on how to get the balance right between having a proportionate approach to ensuring that where children are not in school, that local authorities can be assured that they are receiving a high standard of education, which obviously every child deserves, but they don't make any changes to a parent's ability to educate their child and we absolutely support their right to do that. And obviously the information that will be required in order to make those determinations has been very carefully thought through, but obviously there will be the opportunity to discuss all of this in great detail during committee stage, and obviously whilst I do reject the Honourable Lady's framing of this as because I think it's absolutely right that we have the provisions in place to make sure that every child is safe, and we have a duty to do so.
And just on the point around registers, worth saying that we will be engaging with stakeholders to ensure that any burdens the registers impose on parents are minimalised, and also worth adding that we will consult on statutory guidance to support local authorities and schools to implement these measures in a proportionate way. I think we've heard today from the witnesses how strong those measures will be and what difference they can make.
Okay, so here's the setting. Minura Wilson, who is the Liberal Democrats spokesperson on education, very pro-registers, did ask McKinnell and Morgan, why have you put in such an onerous list of information that you want from parents? Do you really need that to be able to operate an effective register? I'm sure we all like that question, right? McKinnell's reply isn't what the TES said, right? Notice I'm highlighting what she said in orange here. She says, we have given quite significant consideration to and had consultation with stakers on how to get the balance right and having a proportionate approach. So she's saying they've done a lot of work on the list that they've put in, that list of tutors, of places people go, and so on. They've done a lot of work on it. Then she says this is to ensure that local authorities can be assured. And then she says, right at the end in white, the information that will be required to make those determinations has been carefully thought through. McKinnell wasn't for giving any grounds to Wilson on the list. It was Morgan, in fact, who came up with it. He said, it is worth saying that we will engage with stakeholders to ensure that any burdens the registers have imposed on parents are minimised. Hang on, McKinnell said, we've got it down to a minimum. But it was Morgan who said, we will consider it further. And in orange, I've just highlighted that he's confirmed that, well, they had to be, but he's confirmed there will be a consultation on the statutory guidance before it's published. But notice, to support local authorities and schools to implement the measures in a proportionate ways, not to help things for home educators. So when I first read that headline or that comment in the TS thing, I thought, can't believe it, this is too good news. Now I've seen it and things, I think, no, there is problems here. I'm not sure I like it. But where does it take us? Well, it takes us to my dandelions. You know what a dandelion looks like. And I'm sure you've gone around trying to pulling the heads off in your garden so they don't go to seed, but that doesn't stop them growing. What you've got to do is get the roots out. And it's the same with this bill. The Children's and Wellbeing Bill has got bad things above the ground, but it's got even worse things below the ground. And by that, I mean mandatory registration of home educated children, the monitoring of home educated children, and the assessment of how they are progressing. And if all we do, and if anybody proposes anything that simply cuts the heads off the dandelions, don't get distracted. If the roots are left in the ground that are in this bill, it will impact generations of home educators going forward. And if you go looking in the human rights memo, you will discover that the Department of Education actually believes it can enforce mandatory school attendance on all children. And so this is what is embedded in this bill. So it's no good cutting off the tops, the leaves that are onerous and things. We have to get the roots out. But what are the roots and where do they come from? Well, I'm going to show you another video In 2022, the schools bill was introduced. It created a lot of stir in the House of Lords, not because of the register side, but because of what the Conservative government wanted to do with academies and so on. It was so badly written, the Lords stopped it and it came to a grinding halt. But even they didn't want to lose the registers and what is now the independent educational institution sections. And they tried to get the bill moved through like that, but they also wasn't willing to let it go. But there was a lot of people lobbying, and that, as the Conservative government was sending out signals that it would be killed off, the bill, the schools bill, the lobbying got higher. It didn't work because in December, the bill was finally laid to rest. But prior to that, the Centre for Social Justice released a report, and the same evening, the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, and Head of Ofsted then, Amanda Spielman, went on Newsnight, and they told us how terrible home education was and how dangerous. And this is a clip from what the interviewer said to Amanda Spielman.
So, Amanda Spielman, England is an outlier internationally. The highest proportion of pupils have education at home and the lowest amount of regulation in Europe. A laissez-faire attitude just doesn't work.
We are exceptionally permissive. It's one of a positive characteristic of British society as well, that we are so open and leave so much space for the individual. But here it really obviously has some very worrying consequences, because parents do have the obligation to have their child educated, but they don't have an obligation to make sure that's at school. And we have a great deal of supervision and oversight of schools, both in terms of the education quality, there's a wider safeguarding, but none of that extends to children who are home educated.
So Kirsty Walk told Spielman that England is an outlier internationally when it comes to monitoring and registering home educators, and that while we've got the highest proportion of home educated children, we have the lowest amount of regulation, right? We're not quite sure what else she said, but this was the scene that was set for Amanda Spielman. So Spielman said, we're exceptionally permissive. This was a problem for her. While she had to admit it's a positive thing of British society, she said, oh, it's got some really obvious worrying consequences when it comes to home education. And so this is where she's coming from. She's coming from this point that we need to rein in permissive civil liberties. Why? Because the state needs to watch over what parents are doing. On the other side of the coin, I'm going to show you another clip. This isn't a proper video, it's an audio recording from when Lord Sumption, once very highly rated on as a Supreme Court judge, now retired, appeared in 2020 on the BBC's World at One to talk about the early stages of the COVID-19 lockdowns. And it's worth listening to. Unheard thought it was so important they actually put the recording on their website and transcribed it. And all the links to these things will be in the notes under the video. So this is a clip from the opening part of what Lord Sumption had to say.
The real problem is that when human societies lose their freedom, it's not usually because tyrants have taken it away. It's usually because people willingly surrender their freedom in return for protection against some external threat. And the threat is usually a real threat, but usually exaggerated. And that's what I fear we are seeing now. The pressure on politicians has come from the public. They want action. They don't pause to ask whether the action will work. They don't ask themselves whether the cost will be worth paying. They want action anyway.
Assumption began by saying there's a problem that happens that leads human societies to lose the freedom. It's not commonly because tyrants take it away. It's usually because people willingly surrender their freedom in return for protection against some external threat. And that threat is usually a real threat, but usually exaggerated. And that's what he felt was happening to society with the response to coronavirus. Now, you can think about that. I'm just looking at his analysis of what's happened over history. I am not so much looking at whether he was right or wrong there. But what he said is an observed fact. Now, to us as home educators, what's happening feels like we're being threatened. But put your shoes in for a minute in the place of the average citizens who's heard all the negative press, or councillors, local councillors who really are not politically astute, hear it in the press, hear the media going on about these terrible cases, and they hear the words home education time and time again. They begin to think that there is a real threat, right? It's a real threat, but it's being exaggerated. And that is what's happening around us. It's happened recently with Sarah Sharif. It's happened with many other cases. It's always been exaggerated. There's a connection here. Okay. He says the public put pressure on the politicians, but the public don't stop to ask themselves whether the costs will be worth paying. This is the question you need to think about. Everybody should think about unintended consequences. If we get this, what will the cost be? Well, we need to move on. Now, this isn't said by anybody. It's out there. This is my summary of things. We have a problem that grows, and it has done over history, when the rulers, when the government, when the state loses its connection with the people. I think we're in that at the moment. I remember reading somebody saying that, and certainly in my childhood 50 years ago, politicians were accessible. They were local people. Okay, they were not perfect, but they were connected with the people they worked amongst. Now, with everything, they're less and less connected, and they live in the Westminster bubble. And they live in the other bubbles. This week, as I'm saying this, I don't know if it's still going on, but the last few days, the World Economic Forum has been meeting in Davos. And world leaders have been going there to talk to one another. But do they come and talk to us? Well, the premise I've got is that we now have governments, not just in England and Britain, but across the West at least, that are significantly disconnected from the people they are meant to be serving. And when that happens, it's well attested in philosophical writing, the ruler begins more and more to consider themselves to be a capable person. And they have to rule because the people they're looking after are incapable. And as that snowballs, they feel that they have to do more and more for their subjects. But in order for them to do that, the subjects have to surrender their responsibilities to the leader. Now, that penny dropped, that clearly recently, it really did explain a lot of what we're seeing. So the government, and you listen to the way this Labour government and its ministers talk, it is, we are capable, we will fix it, we will stop children going through falling through the cracks, we will stop this, we will do this, we will sort out the economy. It is about they're capable people. But you're not capable. We will monitor every child. Why? Because their parents aren't capable of looking after them. How did we get here? How did they get to that point? Because over decades, British parents have asked the state to do more and more for their children. And the state's like that because it sticks mums out to work, and mums out at work shoves up the GDP, the gross domestic product, economics, and things get better. But they want things to improve, but to do that, they have to take more and more responsibilities away from citizens. So here's a diagram that I want to put more information on as we go along. The yellow dot is the current status quo in society. It's there because I need of that point because I need space on the page. But it's where we're at today. Now it's not never static, it's always moving, but that's where we're at today. And then imagine what will happen if suddenly a new threat comes along. Sumption says there's a reaction amongst the public, and the politicians come into that gap because they feel they're being asked to do something to protect. We've seen it recently with the Southport murders, the tragic Southport murders. But the thing was, what's there wasn't working, so what are we being told? We need more of it. Still won't work, by the way, but we need more of it to stop it happening again. So the reaction is, and people say, yes, we want it. But some of us say, hang on, that's not quite right. And what you get some citizens who push back against the reaction and they resist the changes. And you come to a place where there is almost a compromise. There becomes a new status quo. But it rarely goes back to align with where the situation was before. And if it doesn't get right back to that situation, citizens lose agency and they lose liberty. And you can see at the bottom of my diagram, we've got this line that says there's a drift here from individual agency, individual responsibility to state control. And if we don't push back enough, we will never regain it, because once a new status quo gets established, it is really difficult to push it back. Now, here we go. What happens if you stack up shifts like that over a decade, over 2 decades, over 5 years? I don't know. But can you see what happens? If you don't push it, the new status quo, as far back as possible, when they stack up, it doesn't take long to get to the place where state control increases. Now, China has always been a society that is very dependent on its rulers. And the rulers have often exercised a lot of control over its people. And you see that there today. I'm not going to go into it, but just have a look at what's happening in China to people and how they are under constant monitoring and how they are urged to do what the government wants and penalised for not doing it. And the more state control you get, the heavier handed it comes. And this bill when it comes to forcing people to comply, is very heavy-handed. So, but what I can say to you, this diagram isn't imaginary, because there's always going to be threats. And these threats are going to come at regular intervals, and it's going to go. Now, during wartime, when we've been attacked by an external enemy, the public will say, yeah, we'll accept that. But it doesn't always then reset. And this is the problem. So there's a steady drift in any society that has to be resisted, where the state gets too big and the individual loses all their agency. And we've got to be careful about it. But there's one big question. Do rulers do it? Does this happen unintentionally on the part of rulers? I'm sure it does on the part of citizens. Or is it intentional? Now, that's a big question. I want to say my opinion is that quite commonly, rulers are themselves being panicked by what's happening, and it's not thought through. But at other times, rulers have a plan in place to use this dynamic to their advantage. If you want to explore this further, how old are passports? Well, they really came into being after the First World War because of health concerns. They were a health pass, but now they're cemented, and if you lose your passport, you can't travel. You've lost your liberty. And that article, there are others around, and that is one that looks at the contentious history of passports, just to give you an example. But now I want to move on, because having said many times it can be unintentional, there are times when rulers use it intentionally. And George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a German philosopher who lived between 1770 and 1831, set out what is now called the Hegelian dialectic. He says a state that wants to centralize power has an agenda, correct? And they have a thesis. And the thesis is a problem that needs solving. The person who drew this diagram says it's a terror threat, fake or real. Assumption says it's something that happens that's exaggerated. They propose a solution. In comes the arguments from the other side, the concerned citizens who are concerned at an increasing police state. And Hegel says you then find a place in the middle, the synthesis, which results in the removal of freedom and the transfer of power. And you won't read a little bit at the bottom, so I'll read it out to you. The Hegelian dialectic is any systematic reasoning, exposition, or argument that juxtaposes opposed or contradictory ideas and usually seeks to resolve their conflict. Now, there's times when that's good. That is what international peacekeeping is about. But it doesn't always work, because people say, no, what I'm going to lose is too much. Hegel had a different view on it. This is a famous quote from his, and he says that truth is found neither in the thesis nor the antithesis, but in an emergent synthesis which reconciles the two. Now, he's not a happy-looking fellow, is he? That's the classic picture of him. He didn't want his portrait painting, I don't think. I would say he's wrong there, because the result is not truth. It's not always the best, but it always is a compromise. And it's often a compromise which one side allows because it's less worse than what it was going to be. But I want to say to you today, we've got to be careful of compromises, because compromises don't resolve the issue. And what am I talking about? I think home educators have seen the Hegelian dialectic at work for the last 15 years. I came into this area in 2009 when Ed Balls, a Labour minister, introduced a bill to bring about the registration of children, and he did it by creating a threat following the tragic death of Kyra Ishak. I'm not going to go into the details. Have a look, search the internet, look at my rest of my website. I've got lots of information there about Kyra Ishak. Now, 15 years later, Bridget Phillipson did the very same move with Shara Sarif. She magnified a threat. She said, this is terrible. This is all about home education. Well, not quite all about, but this girl would have been protected if she hadn't been home educated. And it's now time to push back. But the danger is we don't push back far enough, because the threat has been so big, half a victory to us feels like better than no victory. But it doesn't feel as good as a victory. And the victory is to maintain a ground where there is no mandatory registration of children being educated otherwise than in school. The victory is to make sure there is no continual monitoring. And that has been partly lost because when the 2019 guidance, came out, and there was a pushback in the courts, it didn't push back far enough. It accepted the guidance was valid and it should have been challenged, and it wasn't challenged in the court. And now we've got a more difficult situation on our hands. But we can push back, because if they can't get the monitoring in, the registration and monitoring in, they will not be able to operate it. And we've also got to resist assessment. All these three things are what the Department for Education have said they want, but they have also said the end goal in their minds is that they can compel children to attend school, full stop. And that is what they really want. So we have got an example, plenty of examples. There's been examples before Kyra Ishak. There's been examples in the gap between Kyra and Sarah. Dylan Seabridge from Wales being one name that many people think. And as we go forward with this bill, we have got to lobby, and we have got to begin to think how else, if lobbying fails, which it probably will, I'm sorry to say, how else are we going to push back on this narrative that home education is a threat to children? No, it's not. The school system damages far more children than home education has ever done. Yes, there may be occasions when somebody uses it for other reasons than the best for their children. But the majority of home educators wouldn't go down this road if they didn't believe, or if they didn't have evidence that family-based learning is far better than classroom herding together of children. I hope you found it helpful. Bit longer than I thought, but let's hope both parts of this gives you a thing. Remember, now is the time to start trying to get your MP interest before the third reading, and also to begin to research laws and find ways of approaching them that isn't just bombarding them with letters. And let's keep pressing, and let's push back against this narrative. Thank you for listening.